네, 안녕하세요. 요새 관세 협상이라든가 새로운 정부의 정책에 대해서 많은 관심들이 있는데요. 외국에서는 한국을 어떻게 보고 있을까? 이번 협상을 또 어떻게 보고 있을까? 이런 궁금증도 생깁니다. 그래서 오늘 컨설팅 기업 유라시아그룹의 제레미 찬 연구원을 모셨는데요. 우리나라 분과 결혼하셔서 찬서방이라고도 제가 부를 수 있을 것 같습니다. 한국어도 잘하시고요. Hello, Mr. Chan.
Hello, Mr. Sa. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, good to be here.
Would you introduce yourself and Eurasia Group for our audience?
Sure. My name is Jeremy Chan. I'm a senior analyst on the China and Northeast Asia team at the Eurasia Group. I research primarily the Korean Peninsula, so that's both South Korea and North Korea, as well as a lot of sort of China's foreign policy and how China's interacting with its region. The Eurasia Group, as your listeners are probably familiar with, is a political risk advisory firm. We primarily advise corporations and investors on geopolitical events that happen around the world and potential risks that could impact their business or global markets.
So what is your view on the recent trade deal between South Korea and the United States?
Yeah, obviously high drama, high stakes. South Korea was able to pull it off in the end. I think it was not clear initially that they were going to get a deal prior to August 1, and so I think having any deal is already a positive outcome, particularly the one that they ended up walking away with, which is, as a benchmark, at least comparable to the deals that Japan and the EU secured over the last week or week and a half. The 15% rate across the board is a acceptable one, at least in relative terms. It's no higher than the rate that Japan will face, for example. I also think that Korea had to give up a little bit less, to tell you the truth, from their side, 350 billion versus 550 billion for Japan and even larger sums for the EU. I also think that a lot of the investments that they're going to make in the US, whether it's shipbuilding or semiconductors, are investments that will be productive both for the United States but also for South Korea and its industries. And so I think overall it was a very positive outcome for South Korea.
Well, overall it's a very positive outcome to Korea, but for car industry and steel industry, it's not a best outcome for those industry. What do you think about that? Yeah.
Well, on autos, it looks like South Korea secured a 15% rate, which is not zero, but it's not 25, right? And once again, relative to what Japan is facing, Japanese car makers are facing, or German car makers are facing, it will keep Korean automakers competitive in going into the future. I think steel and aluminum makers are going to face higher rates, and there's just really no getting around that at this point. Those are industries that will suffer, I think, in relative terms, selling into the U.S. market. I think it's going to force a lot of Korean firms to move their manufacturing to the United States for any products that they want to sell into the market there. I think you saw some of that happen in the early days of the second Trump administration. You saw Hyundai, the big announcement of their steel factory in Louisiana. So I think that's more or less how the market is going to move.
Well, how do you evaluate the so-called mascot project, the Making America's Shipbuilding Great Again? Do you think that's a very smart move for Korea?
I think it was a smart move for Korea for a couple of reasons. One is I think South Korea has a very strong comparative advantage in shipbuilding, and I think that Washington knows it. And that's a high priority for not only the Trump administration, but for Trump himself particularly. He really wants to revive shipbuilding in the United States, and there's a broad recognition in the White House that the only way to do that is through partnering with South Korean industry. If you won't do it with China, right? So I think South Korea had a unique strength and an opportunity here. I also think there are potential sort of commercial and profitability upsides for the two Korean firms. It looks like they're going to be mostly driving the shipbuilding revival in the United States. So I think it was a smart strategy, and it paid off in the end.
Well, unlike Korea and Japan, Taiwan, India, they couldn't make the trade deal till August 1st.
Correct.
So what do you think Korea has more advantage when they compete those Taiwanese and Indian manufacturers in U.S. market?
Well, an advantage for now in relative terms because they're going to face a lower tariff rate. So I think they absolutely have one. I think they also, given that they are arguably the United States' top or second most important ally in East Asia, I think that they had an advantage as well. I think that South Korea was top of mind for Washington in these negotiations. I think you saw that both with the letters that went out a few weeks ago that were initially interpreted quite negatively, right? Because they're individually addressed to the leaders of each country, Prime Minister Ishiba, President Lee, for example. But I think that also indicated, and was not properly appreciated at the time, that for Trump, these are the countries that really matter. These are the countries he wants to get deals with first. And so I think you saw that yesterday as well, that what the White House did was they kind of took the South Korea file and they put it at the front of the line because they really wanted to get a deal before August 1st. And so the fact that the Taiwanese and Indians couldn't was an indication of that.
What do you think about the U.S. and China trade deal? Where is it going right now?
Well, we've had our third round of talks in Stockholm earlier this week. It looks like momentum has slowed a bit. I think there was more positive momentum coming out of London. Out of Stockholm, it looks like there's basically an agreement to continue talks, right? So it looks like we're going to get an extension of the 90-day period after August 12th. That would probably put us into the middle of November, give or take. And that means that there will be subsequent rounds of discussions. I think that once we got past the initial obstacle, which was the rare earth restrictions in China and the export controls in the US, once you resolve that matter, you get to the really thorny issues. Things like, for example, fentanyl, right? And things like economic restructuring in China. Issues that are going to be very difficult for Beijing to accede to and difficult for, I think, Washington to accept without. So, in other words, I think that US-China relations will continue in a relatively positive direction, or at least a warming trend, but I think it will slow down and become a little more complex over the next few months.
Do you think that China has like advantage over U.S. When they have this trade deal and negotiations?
Yeah, frankly, I do think that. I think China had some advantages, first of all, because they were able to escalate against the United States or retaliate in a way that other countries weren't. And so initially that looked like that was a faulty strategy, right? Because it saw in a tit-for-tat battle where Trump raised U.S. rates as well, and it looked like we were heading to a full economic decoupling of bilateral trade between the two countries. But quickly you saw President Trump back down from that because there were market implications, right, where it looked like there were going to be an economic shock in the U.S. And so if anything, the Chinese sort of called Trump's bluff and to their own benefit.
Well, I think the Chinese really want to strike a deal because they don't have good economy right now.
Correct.
So do you agree with this idea, or are they confident, or what?
I think the Chinese are very self-confident right now. I think that the economy is not in a great place, but it's not in a dire place. They're not as desperate, I think, as is commonly assumed outside of the country. I was there a few weeks ago, and I think general sentiment is more positive than folks believe. I think that the reason why the government, for example, is also not acting in a way to revive the property market, for example, or to stimulate domestic consumption is because they feel self-confident and they know that the economy can muddle through in the meantime. So I think there is a broad sense of self-confidence. I think also the recent successes in China in things like AI, DeepSeek, semiconductors, fighter jets, these are all sort of reinforcing this kind of mindset in China that we can persevere through all of these external challenges.
Well, these uncertainties coming from this U.S. trade policy, these uncertainties are very giving pain to investors and companies.
Yeah.
And is there any potential risk that Trump could once again disrupt this done trade deal and put more tariff like next year?
Yeah,
during his term.
I mean, when Trump's in office, anything's in play. So anything is possible, right? I mean, he's Mr. Unpredictable, right? In addition to being Mr. Tariff Man. So absolutely, that's in play, and that will be, I think, a top concern not only for South Korea but for Japan and the EU. That getting a deal done wasn't the end of the road with the United States. There now is a follow-through element, and whether that's going to be the funds that are supposed to show up in these investment funds, or whether that's purchase agreements or market access for U.S. exports, there's going to be, I think, an audit 3, 6, 9 months down the line in the White House where they look at these individual countries and say, are they fulfilling their end of these agreements? And in the case of South Korea, it will be important, I think, to demonstrate real progress.
Okay. Well, we talk about these global issues. I want to talk about these more domestic things. Well, we have new administration, and do you think this Lee's administration is doing well so far?
I think that Mr. Lee's young administration is actually performing very well, and is, if anything, surprising on the upside. They are surprisingly pragmatic and non-ideological. I think that they are surprisingly supportive of markets, investors, corporate interests. And so I think that President Lee is indicating an ability to balance a lot of competing interests, right, between labor and capital, between China and the U.S., between domestic and foreign policy. So I think overall, if anything, early returns have been quite positive, and I think some of the concerns that some foreign governments had and some investors had about the direction that Mr. Lee might take the country have not borne out so far, which is a positive development, to say the least.
What is the best job done by Lee so far?
If you look on the domestic file, I think it's that he's, I would look at the equity market. I would look at what's happened to the Kospi, which is broadly shared too. Because if this was just foreign investors, for example, or just retail investors, you'd think that it didn't really have a lot of legs. But the fact that I think there's this broad understanding that he might actually mean what he says in this instance, and that that Korea could finally erase the Korea discount, or at least minimize it or reduce it. I think that there's real optimism that he's heading in that direction. Mind you, this is a president who, prior to the election, there were widespread doubts that he was not friendly to markets, that he was going to tax and regulate corporations, and as a result of that, I think markets have responded quite positively to him. So that would probably be the most significant domestic, I think, achievement of his so far.
Well, I agree with you about the equity market, because its market is going up and it's showing rally. So I agree with you, but there are controversy over Lee's diplomatic policies. So Lee says he pursued pragmatic diplomacy, but it's really hard to. Well, I think it's time to choose one side for South Korea, and many people. I think many experts agree with this idea. We cannot just keep our neutral stance between China and U.S. What do you think about this? His diplomatic approach.
Well, I would say that there's a rhetorical element to the Lee administration's foreign policy and a practical element. And so you're absolutely right. Rhetorically, he talks a lot about balance and looking out for Korea's national interests. But in practice, at least in the first 2 months, I think if anything, he hasn't deviated too much from the foreign policy of former President Yoon, which is to say the U.S. has a primary position in Korea's foreign policy, both economic and in terms of its security policy. And what's interesting is that at least so far in the early Lee administration, the second place country, I would say in terms of importance, is Japan. It's not China. You saw that in terms of the initial phone calls. He first speaks with the U.S., then Japan, then China. It looks like he's going to go to the U.S. for his first bilateral meeting. He went to G7, obviously, in June. And I wouldn't be surprised if the next country he visits after the United States is Japan, before he has some sort of summit with President Xi in China, maybe around the APEC summit, for example. So I don't know whether he's actually balanced Korea's foreign policy nearly as much as he said he was going to. But to your broader point, I absolutely agree. There will be tension points. It will be difficult for President Lee to both have his cake and eat it too. But with that said, going back to our earlier point, if the distance between the U.S. and the Chinese in terms of trade, tariffs, tech competition is smaller, well, that will give a little more breathing room to President Lee, right? And so we're not heading in a direction now where U.S. export controls against China are going to become stricter or higher and therefore more constrictive for Korea. If anything, we're heading in a loosening direction. And so there probably will be a little more wiggle room for President Lee to both be friendly, obviously, to the Chinese, but maintain strong diplomatic and economic ties with the United States.
Well, Mr. Trump and Mr. Lee, they're going to meet in 2 weeks.
Yeah, ish. We'll see.
Yeah. well, I hope.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what do you expect from the meeting? Yeah.
I think it'll be positive overall. I think that in general, with certain notable exceptions, like President Zelensky from Ukraine, I think that Trump overall actually likes doing the in-person diplomacy. I also think in general he likes engaging with Asian heads of state more than he does with European heads of state. And so I think President Lee is already starting off in a pretty strong position. I also think that they've got a ton of deliverables to talk about during that summit, right? This will not be a meeting that will lack for outcomes. And this will give both President Trump and President Lee plenty to go to their respective presses to, right? Plenty of achievements both on the economic side of the House and on the security side of the House that they can really trumpet. And so I think overall it will be a positive summit.
Well, we talk about the diplomatic policy now. Would you like to talk about the fiscal policy of this? Yeah. So, the government is spending money and they're giving money. And I I got the 15만 원.
Yeah, exactly. I've
Yeah,
heard.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
I did not. I did not get
well.
You'll buy me dinner later.
Yeah, okay. well, I bought 냉면 for my family.
Oh, okay. That's very generous of you.
Yeah. Anyway. Well, I think it's good to use government spending because it is time for fiscal stimulus.
The economy.
But there are many controversy over the scale and the methods. So, what do you think about his fiscal policy and stance over this kind of policy? Yeah,
it's a good question. Obviously, Korea in this particular moment is facing pretty tough economic times, right? Now, you can blame some of that on President Lee, but most of it's not to do with President Lee. He inherited a pretty weak economy, right? With growth outlooks being slashed by the IMF, OECD, et cetera, right? So any responsible leader in the face of essentially a looming recession would move the levers of government and do everything in his or her power to revive the economy. And so this is one Keynesian method of achieving that outcome. I think that it's wise for him to try to stimulate the economy. How effective it will be, I think the jury is still out. Obviously, there'll be a short-term stabilization effect from this, but I don't think that it was done on the scale. I don't think 10만 won per person is going to be enough to really revive the animal spirits in the Korean economy. So the question is heading into 2026, the government budget, for example, that we presented to the National Assembly, within a month or so. Where are the spending priorities heading into 2026? How large will government expansion become, for example, and what sort of taxation changes could we see to pay for some of these more expansionary sort of social welfare policies? I think those are all key questions to be monitoring going forward.
So with this, they're trying to hike tax for the companies. So, do you think it's going to harm animal spirits for those, for entrepreneurs and companies?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, President Lee is responsible enough of a leader to recognize that if you're going to spend more, you're going to have to tax more, right? You can't have these major fiscal gaps. So yes, there will be pain to come, most likely for corporations, potentially for wealthy households and individuals. I think that was very well telegraphed before President Lee even took office, that's where the direction of travel was. At the same time, if the equity market performs as well as it does, for example, and if the trade deal with the U.S. provides short-term stabilization enough to at least expectations that you can have South Korean industry continue to make these investments in the U.S., export. I mean, we saw the export data for July, for example. It was still relatively robust, right? I think that the growth levers are still there overall for Korea going forward. And so I think that the corporations can probably withstand a little bit more of a tax hike. With that said, I do believe that that's probably the greatest friction point potentially in the domestic economy or domestic political scene right now. It's not going to be between labor and capital. It's going to become the corporations and the blue house, in other words.
Well, do you have any numbers for economic growth 2026 or
2026, you're saying? In Korea? I'm not sure if I can quote those off the top of my head. I know 0.8% for 2025. 2026 is probably going to be a little bit higher, but I don't want to quote a number I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, so.
Yeah. Do you know?
Well, I read articles that some experts are raising their numbers from like 1.6 to 1.8. Like,
okay.
So.
Yeah, that's good.
So are you turning more optimistic too?
The economy, you're saying? Yeah, I think I'm returning. I mean, having a president is always better than not having a president, right? Yeah. So prima facie, that's already a good start. I also think that President Lee has indicated that he's not the extremist or the far left progressive that many feared. And as a result of that, I think he's going to be a good balancer, both in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy. And so he's not the type that's going to be, I think, dramatically hiking interest rates or dramatically expanding government expansion, at least, or not to the extent that people were fearing coming into it. And so I think it'll be more incremental. And I also think that fundamentally President Lee wants to be liked. I think he cares about his approval rating. I think he wants to be a popular president. And so therefore he's not going to take actions that are going to be too extreme or at least too much to the benefit of one group or detriment of another group, such that it's going to redound to his political deficit. And so I think that is overall a positive story for the economy going forward. Obviously, there will continue to be trade uncertainties vis-a-vis the U.S., and there will be potential headwinds for the Korean economy. But I think overall 2026 will be a more optimistic year and a story than 2025 was.
Also I want to talk about North Korea. Yeah,
Please.
okay. Well, so the Lee's administration, they're trying to have conversation with NK.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and I think the NK doesn't want to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this friendly approach is meaningful for both South Korea and North Korea. And do you think this can produce meaningful results in the near future or in his term?
So President Lee has made good on his long-term pledges to pursue a more friendly policy, or at least a less confrontational policy with North Korea. We've seen an end to the broadcasts near the border, an end to some of the pamphlets that were, I think, really aggravating North Korea, a resumption of at least sort of, basic communications between the two sides. All of that's positive. With that said, I think that if you zoom out and you look at North Korea, they are in a very different strategic situation than they were even in Trump's first administration. I think that they feel like they benefited, probably one of the only countries in the world that benefited from the Ukraine conflict, that they now have a signed and a blood-forged alliance, essentially, with Russia. They still have a pretty strong relationship with China, and as a result of that, they don't have a whole lot of incentive right now to negotiate with either South Korea or the United States, unless there's something pretty enticing as a result of that, whether it's recognition of them as a nuclear state, whether that's a reduction in U.S. and Korean sanctions, or some sort of payment or whatever that's going to be going across the border. As a result of that, I think you see them playing hard to get, both with Seoul and with Washington.
Well, but as you know, Mr. Trump, he's thinking unlike the normal people. So I think he can strike a deal with Kim Jong-un. He may recognize North Korea as a nuclear state.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, do you think there are possibilities that U.S. and North Korean relations can get improved because of these two strong, weird men?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is probably not in the short term, but probably so in the medium term, which is to say, I think that Trump views North Korea as unfinished business, and he absolutely, within his administration, will want to resume dialogue and take one more swing at the possibility of solving the North Korea question, which obviously has beguiled U.S. presidents for many, many decades. I think fundamentally, he needs to resolve the Ukraine conflict first and some other foreign policy hotspots before he can shift to North Korea. But I think he's signaled early on a strong desire to engage with Pyongyang. The question in my mind is whether North Korea wants to pick up the phone, right, or answer the call when it arrives. It's still unclear to me whether there will be negotiations short of Trump and his team taking the big step, crossing the Rubicon, and essentially acknowledging the reality, which is that North Korea owns a nuclear deterrent and it's not going to bargain it away under any sort of foreseeable circumstance.
This is my last question. Sure. Okay. So, what kind of questions do you get recently from your clients?
About South Korea?
Yeah.
I get two buckets of questions. The most recently, all the questions have been about the U.S.-South Korea trade negotiations, because that's the short-term issue, right? And all the logistical questions: who's talking to whom, when do we get a deal, how will it compare to Japan, what's the economic impact, et cetera. I also get quite a few questions, though, about Lee's administration. His cabinet appointments, what that says about the policy outlook, and where the priorities of the Lee administration will likely be going forward in terms of taxation, in terms of spending, in terms of reform, for example, and the likelihood that Lee and his administration will actually succeed in achieving a lot of the pledges that they've made, whether that's in terms of corporate governance or whether that's in terms of boosting social welfare, for example. Those are the key questions, I think, that investors have their mind on at this moment. I think there's a key division as well in terms of whether Lee really is the pragmatist that he's been in the first 2 months, and whether that will last over time, given how much power is accrued right now in his hands.
Would you summarize your takeaways for that questions for your potential clients or audience?
So do you mean on the trade file or on the domestic file?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
I think my key takeaway is that U.S. and South Korea have gotten to a good place in terms of their trade deal, and that South Korea will, at least in relative terms, be no worse off, or it will not be disadvantaged vis-a-vis other major U.S. trading partners. As a result, I think that it won't negatively impact South Korean trade with the U.S. nearly as much as I think was feared prior to this agreement. So overall, very positive news in terms of the bilateral relationship. In terms of where Lee is heading right now, I'm reassessing some things, I will be honest with you. I think prior to him taking office, I was not quite certain whether Lee, the pragmatist of this most recent campaign, would be the president, or whether we would have Lee, the progressive, right, of previous campaigns. I think that President Lee has indicated, though, that he's not ideological, and that in this particular moment, what he needs to do is to heal a lot of the political divisions in the country, primarily, and focus on reviving the economy. Those are all very popular ideas and things that are going to really improve people's livelihoods. And so I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to get a more pragmatic President Lee, a more non-ideological one, and one that's going to be focusing primarily on doing popular policies, right? So I think overall, that's a pretty positive story to tell as well.